Okay, welcome along. Today is the third in our series of webinars, and we've covered sales and marketing, and now we've got to that wonderful stage where we've won the business, and so it's all about the details of how to onboard a customer.
My name's Paul Fuge. I'm the head of sales for Inbay. I've been with the business now a little bit longer than when we did the previous session, but it's great to be back and speaking with you guys. Joining me today is Paul Sylvester.
So that's myself, and just a little bit about myself. Been working in the MSP sector for about 12 years, in IT for about, I'm not going to tell you how long, too many years so I care to remember. But I've worked on both sides of the fence. So I spent 11 years of my life working for Merlin Entertainment. For those of you who have kids, that's the second largest theme park operator in the world. And on that engagement, that's when I first encountered MSPs, because I used to look after Asia and the US and the UK, and we had MSPs managing our solutions. So I've had some great relationships with MSPs and also some poor relationships with MSPs. And I decided that if I ever worked for an MSP, I would do it a lot different. And 10 years later, I've worked for a selection of MSPs in the South. So I've gathered a lot of intel and battle scars, which I hope to relate to you this morning.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. So in terms of the agenda today, we're really going to focus on the keys around onboarding. It's clearly, we've gone from marketing, which hopefully is generating interest in what we do, to sales, which is actually selling it in the first place. And now we've had this great success and we've sold something. So we're really going to talk through how we then take that customer from that warm and fuzzy feeling of having been sold to actually onboarding them. So our agenda is going to focus really on the key elements of that. Firstly, we're going to talk about what has been sold. I'm sure any of you guys that have worked from a technical perspective and worked with, had to understand that transition between sales and technical. We'll have an insight into how that can sometimes be a challenge. Really talk about what customer onboarding is, and then really creating a customer onboarding process. And that's where Paul's really going to take you through a number of the considerations, focusing on things like the locations and the real specifics of actually understanding what we need to really, what information we need to dig out from our customers when we're going through this process, and also understanding things like the types of users and whether we're dealing with home workers, people that are roaming, and how to bring devices under our management. And then obviously, a bit like the last session, that we'll do a short summary, and there'll be an opportunity for lots of questions with Paul, so and obviously myself if relevant. So yeah, that's our agenda. So the first thing I wanted to talk about really is understanding what's been sold, and I wanted to put this slide up really to highlight the discrepancy that sometimes can exist between the expectations and the reality. And I think what this really taps into from my perspective and from our perspective when Paul and I were chatting about pulling this together is not only the expectation versus the reality from a customer perspective, but also the expectation and reality between sales and technical. And I'm sure, Paul and I sort of joked about it, and I'm sure at some point he'll characterize me as a salesman that causes nothing but trouble by sending over business that perhaps hasn't, that perhaps is not been completely qualified. And I guess from a technical perspective, that characterization from within sales that actually, the technical team or the procurement team is sometimes almost the non-profit division or the guys that are going to make life difficult, that can also, create a challenging reality as well. So I think what we wanted to really talk about in understanding that is actually making sure that when sales does take place, that there's a process in place to ensure that both from the customer's perspective, but also from the perspective of the internal politics and the machinations of us as an organization, of an MSP, that those kind of things are taken care of. So if we move on to the next slide, Paul. So the key thing really, we wanted to talk about 4 key factors. Firstly, understanding what's really been sold. which sounds crazy, but we've certainly had, I think Paul and I were able to draw on scenarios in the past where a process perhaps was in place where a new business person might sell something and then immediately hand it over to an onboarding team or an account manager or a technical person. And actually there was sometimes some challenges, and even, dare I say, customers might exploit that scenario by saying, I don't know, when Paul sold this to me, that this was definitely included. I was definitely expecting this to be part of it as well. So by having a kind of a tight transitional process and actually ensuring that everybody, that the salesperson and the technical ops and maybe the account manager is involved in that process and has a good understanding of what's been sold, that I think is a quick route to ensuring that actually we end up meeting expectation, and also we end up in a scenario where we customers aren't trying to maybe exploit a scenario, or we as an organization aren't being seen to kind of add in hidden costs at a later stage. So really point 2 highlights that further, where ensuring that there's a process and a handover and a really solid communication point whereby the salesperson that's really involved in that delivery is then involved in the communication with things like technical ops and account management and maybe project management during that handover period, to ensure that actually what's been proposed is actually being delivered. I think one of the things that we really wanted to focus on as well is the human element to anything that's being sold as well. Anytime I think we're selling into an organization as an MSP, there's always a human element to it, to that engagement. We certainly, in the past when I've been involved in an MSP and also in any kind of technological sales, there's often people that are really, really positive about the change. And there's also people that are going to be affected in other ways by that change. So really getting a good understanding of who the key stakeholders are within your organization that you're going to be working with is really, really important to ensure that actually any kind of internal politics and sensitivities are really taken care of. Now, obviously in an MSP environment, when we're going in to provide technical services, it's quite possible that people are in some ways maybe reticent and fearful that actually the services we're providing are going to make their jobs a little, potentially redundant, or potentially reduce the importance that they have in the business. So really understanding what we've sold and how that affects the individuals concerned, who the key stakeholders are, I think is very, very important. On another human level, I think it's important to understand why we're there in the first place. 9 times out of 10, as an MSP, we're being brought into a business potentially because of some growth, but also potentially because of some issues that have been caused maybe by a previous provider, whether that be an internal IT team or person, or whether that be a previous MSP. So getting a real key, understanding of what those potential issues are as well is quite important in understanding what we sold and what the key, some of the key features of the process are. And then finally, really agreeing what is in scope and getting full sign off in the delivery. It sounds like quite a straightforward thing, but Paul and I again reflected on projects that I think we'd had experience of being involved with where maybe that hadn't taken, where that hadn't happened, and I think 2 things really came about as a result of that. One being that the project itself perhaps was then delivered in a way that perhaps didn't satisfy all those concerned. And I think from an ongoing account management perspective, if a project if an onboarding process isn't delivered in a way that really satisfies all concerned, then that makes account management on an ongoing basis and growth of a particular relationship quite challenging if you're on the back foot from the word go. So really getting a tight scope, ensuring that everybody involved is really, really happy with what's been sold and what's going to be delivered. That's going to provide the opportunity to transition that new organization into your business very, very successfully, and then make potential growth in the future much more likely. And ultimately, I think we said this in the last session that we worked with you guys, partnership working is key. And I guess the difference in this particular instance, all of the great relationships that we have, that I can think of, or that I've had with businesses over the time that I've been working in kind of technology sales, really felt like partnerships. I think what this also focuses on is the requirement and the need for really solid internal partnerships as well. So really strong processes and really strong relationships internally between sales, technical, procurement, project management, consultancy. Ultimately, that's really, really key to successful delivery. So that's enough from me for the time being. We're going to now focus on a little bit on the specifics of actually what customer onboarding really relates to. So I'm going to hand over to Paul a little bit now, who's going to talk a bit about that.
Good. Okay. So morning, everybody. So let's first of all deal with the elephant in the room, the bad news. So customer onboarding, you're not going to make money on it. Now, what we're talking about here, it's very difficult to break even when you onboard a customer. Why? Well, because effective onboarding is going to take you at least 3 to 4 days with the amount of information that you need to gather from a technical perspective. And this is not a technical meeting. We're not going to go technical on you. But for you stakeholders, you need to understand the amount of information that is needed to be gathered or considered so that you can ensure that that customer transition from one MSP to another, or even from an internal team to your team, is smooth and you basically pick up from where the salespeople left on. And often, if you are taking over from a previous MSP, they're not going to be willing to hand you any information. I know I'm certainly not when I lose business to another customer, because that's your hard-earned money, that's your USP, so to speak. So why would you hand it over to another company? So that means that you're going to have to gather that information yourselves. Now, one thing you can't do is go to the customer, because the customer may not know enough about their systems to be able to help you. They certainly aren't technical. That's the reason why they've brought you in. And your customers will expect you from day one to be able to pick up and run with their infrastructure. So that means that you're going to have to send people on site, perhaps an engineer or 2 engineers, depending on the size of the business, to gather all that information. And not many people or customers will be willing to pay for 3 or 4 day consultancy when they are made the assumption that actually that's something that you're supposed to be an expert. So if you have that understanding that this is actually going to cost you in the first instance, but it's going to pay back dividend later, it will help soften the blow. Now, with customer onboarding, the first thing that you need to do is understand their IT. Now, how do you understand their IT? Well, there's a couple of methods you can choose. You can have 5 engineers who you've dedicated to doing onboarding and let them go out and gather the information as they see fit. And then what you'll get is 5 different interpretations of the information that you need for your support team to be able to provide support to that individual, that company. Or you can create a more uniform, a more pragmatic method, and that's in the form of a checklist. Now, how big and what should you use for this checklist is entirely up to you. It could be paper-based, it could be electronic. The choice is yours, but the information that it captures needs to be uniform so that any engineer that you send out to capture the information is going to be the same. And this document, this checklist, is not a static document. It's a fluid document. It's a document that will evolve as you do more and more onboarding. And also, it will allow you to be able to understand the kind of gotchas that onboarding and some of the hazards that it can bring. Now, the customer, you need to have a stakeholder from the customer to assist you with this, because customers don't understand onboarding. They don't know the complexity of it. Having a stakeholder can help translate that into the other stakeholders so they can see that if an issue does come up, why that's being the case. Plus, you need to understand the complexities of their systems, what's hot, what's not, and we'll come on to that shortly. And the only way you can do that is to have somebody who uses the system day to day. So as part of the checklist, in fact, pre-checklist, you want to have a nominated stakeholder from the business that's going to help you to review that or fulfill that checklist. And your checklist, like I said before, because it's not a static document, you need to review it constantly. Quarterly, if you can, but certainly every 6 months, you need to review its effectiveness to keep it fresh and to ensure that it's doing what you want it to do. So customer onboarding, understanding the customer's business. Now, why is this important? Well, the relationship with a customer is with the salesperson. So a salesperson, new business sales, they have that relationship with the customer. They take them out and wine and dine them and really get to know their business. But your service desk, they're not part of that engagement. So when a customer says, okay, you know what, you look like a really good business, we're going to sign up for you for 3 years, and then you start that onboarding process, there is a disconnect between the service desk and the account management team. So the best way to bridge that is have a good and frank conversation with the sales team, but also get your team, your support desk, to understand that business. Understand the customer's business. What do they do? What effects do systems or down systems have on them? How many people is this affecting? Having that kind of intel will help your guys on the service desk to relate to that customer. So instead of a faceless entity, they now have a picture of this business that they're now supporting. A bit like if someone was starting a business from new and they were supporting IT, they will probably have some kind of induction process where they'll meet various departments, and that will give them an understanding of the business. You need to do the same with your teams inside. Now, of course, you're not going to sell your whole team up, but nominate a person who will become the that company specialist, and then send them on site if you can, so they can meet and greet people. And that has a fantastic effect, because as humans, we work better when we interact with people. So talking to someone on the phone, you form a relationship. Seeing someone visually, you form a deeper relationship. Having regular meetings with that, you begin to form a bond. And with your team, that's what you want. You want your teams to have a bond with that customer. So when they call up and they say X system is down, your teams are not saying, well, that's just another ticket. They're saying, well, actually, X system means that this is not working and they can't do this and this is affecting that. Right, we need to jump on these guys. And that helps to build that relationship. So understand in how failed systems affect their business will help your team to react in the appropriate way when those systems go down, and thus build that relationship both from a sales perspective, but also from the service desk. So how do you gather that information? This is the intel bit. Gathering intel, gathering asset information, the most effective way to do this is to use software. So there are various tools in the markets that you'll be aware of. So N-Central, Kaseya, all these are information gathering tools. But a lot of companies will get these tools and only learn a section of these really good tools. But really what you need to do is really get to grip with these tools to make them work for you. They're quite expensive items anyway, any tools. You need to put them to work. So software is definitely a huge a bonus, because that's going to reduce the amount of time that you're going to be spending doing your onboarding. Also documenting the system. What do you use for your documentation? There are tools out there, and we'll discuss a couple of those tools later on. But having a good document library that is laid out in an organized fashion so your team can find information will not only speed up resolution, but will also show how professional you are in terms of gathering that information and using it to full effect. And there are software, so N-Central will work well with a product called IT Glue, and it will actually feed that product with information, thus saving you having to double handle documentation. And that comes to the third bit. The two systems must work hand in hand. If you've got a desperate system that requires a lot of work on your part, review it. This is your assets that needs to work for you. It should be the other way. You shouldn't be keeping software because you like the vendor or because you've always used it. So you need to really adapt and use software that's going to save you time, because time is money. You think about that pot, every month you've got that revenue sitting there that it's accruing from that contract, and every time your guys are spending an hour looking for information, that's an hour of revenue that you've lost. So you've got software that's giving you that information quickly and efficiently. That means that you can get that ticket resolved quickly, and it means that you can move on to the next customer and thus make more revenue, which is why we're all here. So hot systems. What are hot systems? Well, another term for hot systems is critical systems. Have a clear plan on how you're going to deal with those. So these are the kind of things that you discover during your onboarding. So the customer say, well, I got this system here and it's really vital to our operation. An illustration of that, I had a customer that on the surface looked really simple. They had a whole lot of trucks and they went out and they collected refuge. How easy is that? Well, what we didn't know was that actually for these trucks to even be able to leave the yard, they had to use this software system that barcode scanned the vehicle and then allowed them to be able to track the vehicle, and because they used it to monitor performance, etc., etc. And if that system was down, the truck would not be able to leave the yard. So that was a crucial system, and this system had to be running by 6 a.m. So it's that kind of information that you need to gather and that your team need to know about so that you can give the correct response. For us, we missed that. So when the first time it happened, no one thought it was important. All of a sudden, you've got the CEO on the phone and spitting fire down the line because their system's gone down. Not a very good introduction to the business. So understanding those hot systems is vital for you to be able to be determined to do step 2, which is agree in advance with the customer a plan of action of how you will deal with that. Now, step 3 may involve a third party. So a third party may be the company that has created this app, this application. So you need to have in place with them an OLA, operational level agreement, of how you will deal with that in the event of an outage. And it's not a case that you want to apportion blame, but if there has to be a major incident and you have to write an MIR, you need to be able to clearly identify where the faults were or where the issues were, not so that you can point fingers, but so you can improve those processes. So having a written process of how you deal with those systems that the customer agrees and then evolves will certainly help you to smooth out any problems that occur when you do have outages. And you will have these outages and you will have systems, but the way that you deal with those outages and the way you demonstrate to the customer the processes that you have in place to perfect those will strengthen the relationship no end. So, some considerations. Device type. Now, it's very easy to say, do you know what, we support everything. We've got people who support everything. That's easy to say. But actually, it's quite dangerous. Let's talk about that. So there's 4 things that we're going to consider here. The questions that you need to ask yourself before you send your engineers out to do onboarding. So number 1, what type of devices do you support? Now, many MSPs are Wintel shops, but there are 1 or 2 people who support Macs or Apple devices. Now, once your salespeople hear that, as far as they're concerned, you sell Apple devices. So they will sell that as a contract. So you need to really define, well, actually, yeah, we do have 1 or 2 people, but we don't offer that as a service. And that way, if you then take on a shop that's 90% Apple, you're not going to fall short when you can't support them because the 2 people who do know about them happen to be on holiday that week. So that's something that you need to put in place in the first instance. Number 2, do I have the staff to support all of these devices? Again, same thing. If you're supporting servers, desktops, Wintel devices, Apple devices, Linux, do I have the sufficient amount of people based on the number of the devices that I'm supporting? Number 3, how many servers am I supporting against desktop devices? Some MSPs will support purely server-based solutions. Some will be perhaps have Citrix backend, and so will support Citrix front-end devices. Again, a conversation that you need to have well before you get your first onboarding or you onboard customers. Are most of my customers Office 365 customers? Again, that will determine that you will then have a multiple different type of devices that you will need to support. Have you considered this? And do you have the people who can support Office 365? I know Office 365 has been around for a number of years, but you'll be surprised how many MSPs fall short on having actual people who are fully up to speed with Office 365. They perhaps rely on the fact that they're IT professionals, so they'll get around to it. That's not something that is acceptable. You need to have people who are trained in Office 365 and can handle different device types. So, device age. you need to set yourself a device policy. Now, why do we say that? Well, it's many manufacturers, for example, HP will have a 4-year shelf life. So you can buy 4 years worth of support from HP. What happens at year 5? Well, the support price rises hugely, extortionately. And why? Because HP deemed that to be a risk to their support. So therefore they raise the price. And the whole reason in doing that is to encourage you to upgrade. And the same for you. The older the device, the more impact it's going to have on your support. So what's the maximum age? Have you considered that? Are you going to support desktop devices that are over 5 or 6 years? Oh, desktops are even more of an issue because it becomes more difficult to get parts, RAM, etc. for these devices. Because once they go out of life, then you're relying on a third-party hardware company to be able to support that. So those are considerations that you need to add, and that actually needs to be part of your checklist. But is there an option where you can support older devices? Well, if you do, that might give you a bit of a competitive edge because most MSPs don't want to support older devices. They'd rather sell you something new and shiny. But in some organizations, for example, in the medical field, they will have older infrastructure because the software that runs on that device is certified to that device. So changing that means they have to go for a recertification. I had that with a company that I worked with in Japan, that they couldn't change their infrastructure because the software was governed by the hardware that it sat on. And also I did some work for a defense firm where they were using embedded XP. Now XP went end of life many years ago, but they couldn't because the XP, the embedded XP devices were sitting in these fuel refuelers. So they had to have XP in part of their network. So were we able to support them? Well, we did. What we did was we created a custom contract to allow that support to take place. And that custom contract had a lot of caveats, and that's something that you need to consider. And of course, the other thing with age device is vendor support, software vendor support. That will also have a bearing as to whether you will support and what age that you will support devices. So that's a consideration that you really need to have in place and have that as part of your checklist. And again, the same goes for operating system age. With operating system, this is quite an important one, and you do need to have a very clear policy on this because non-supported operating systems actually hurt your business. But if you manage it well, it can actually work to your advantage. Again, using the same illustration that we did in the last instance, some software companies or some medical companies in the medical field have to use older software because they just can't afford to move to a newer software, or the software is certified on those systems. So what we did, we created a caveat. So they were able to use the current support mechanism that we had in place, but we allowed for 1 hour under that. And then after that, we had a surplus charge. So every hour, we charged them a fee. And they agreed how many hours that we would continue to work on the system until such time that it became uneconomical. For you, it's great because it means that you're burning time, but actually you're doing it at a premium rate. But more importantly, you're not burning into your monthly accrual that the older software will hurt.
This probably comes back to, Paul, doesn't it? That sales engagement at the start, setting expectation along those lines, I think is probably really, really crucial. So again, these things don't feel like hidden costs. Someone feels like they're getting an all-you-can-eat package, but ultimately it turns out that we then start throwing in what they then consider are erroneous charges at some point in the future. So having that joined up approach at the start, I think, is really crucial to then make those conversations a bit less awkward as time goes by. Indeed, absolutely. And this is actually where your sales team can come to your aid, because if you've got the systems in place and a good PSA such as Dattp and ConnectWise will help you with this, you should be able to demonstrate to the customer when you have those reviews, actually, you are spending X amount each month on this system. So you're showing that actually there's a problem here and it's costing you a lot of money. Your sales team can then, look, we can upgrade you to the next version and it will save you this amount, because these systems will then come into your normal support portfolio. So it's an excellent way you can upsell. And of course, like I said, it might be a reason why the customer can't move,
But if there isn't, you've got that opportunity to be able to use your sales team to upgrade their hardware and their software to meet your support objectives. So let's take a look at out-of-hours support. Now, out-of-hours support is an interesting one because most MSPs, or a lot of MSPs, don't have it. They will normally work a 7 to 6 schedule, and then out of hours, but after that, it's the next day. But you may have a customer who has some international legs, so they require 24/7 support. So how do you deal with that? Well, there's a couple of ways. You need to have, if you are going to run your out of hours yourself, it goes without saying that it needs to be profitable for you. But that one customer then allows you to launch your out-of-hours service as a whole, or you can outsource it to a third party who has the out-of-hours support. And that way, you may still have your engineers who work out of hours, but they may use another party to monitor systems and alert them when the system goes wrong. Now, the trouble with out-of-hours service is such a difficult one to staff, because staff are prone to leaving after a while. They're very enthusiastic because you're paying them a premium rate, but trust me, after a few weeks of doing nights, the novelty soon wears off. And what you tend to find is that you have a high turnover of staff. So outsourcing, point 3, is a really effective way, because the outsource deals with that problem. You just have a system that flicks over to them, and then they monitor the system, and then your engineers are perhaps woken up to deal with the issue. So
I was going to say, Paul, I met with an MSP yesterday who actually didn't really have any kind of joined up approach for out of hours, and ultimately wanted to be seen to do really great service for their customer. So it was just one of those things that they got guys to leave their mobiles on, and in some instances they charged an enhanced rate, and in some instances they didn't. But the reality is, actually no one was happy, because the out of hours service wasn't great. There was no SLAs attached to it. The customer itself didn't feel like they were getting a brilliant service, and actually the sales team, in a way, because there was nothing in place for the account managers to talk about, actually didn't have anything to it wasn't a conversation that they felt comfortable having with their customers. So it was almost just something that was fudged a little bit. So in a funny kind of way, having some kind of process that can then enable you to almost put it out there, and then actually get, put the ball in the customer's court to say, well, this is something we can provide for you, and there is a structure around it, and there are SLAs that we can meet. Is that something of interest? And then there's not that real ambiguity around the fact that someone made a phone call on a Sunday and didn't get any response to 8 a.m. Monday morning. So and that again is that communication piece. I think that which to us is interesting. Given the technical element of what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely, indeed. And it also, when you're considering out of hours, and we will touch on this later on, actually. So it's what you're offering. So are you offering just devices, or you're offering support to people? When it comes to support for people, it's really important that you actually have a policy for this, because a person calls up at night, you don't know who they are. And I know you probably have the same issue during the day, but at nighttime, that's when most cyber attacks happen, because no one is around. So all of a sudden, someone calls a service desk and says, hey, I'm so-and-so person. You need to have a system to challenge them, some kind of free and two-factor authentication that person can use in order to authenticate themselves. So something to consider. Okay, so we're going to take a look at locations now, and why you need to consider the different locations that may make up the business. So some companies that you'll support will have multiple locations. You need to cover this as part of your checklist, because often when you send an engineer to site to do the onboarding, they go to a site, and that's already costing you money. So if you then have to send them to a second site, that's another day out of the business that engineer is not earning money. So make sure that this is picked up in the sales process. No doubt it will be, because the sales team will be keen to ensure that they cover the whole estate. And then you can then talk about how you're going to cover that as part of your onboarding. With multiple sites, customers are more willing to pay for the fact that they have to get engineers to site. And you can use that as a caveat as well. Look, we can, so in other words, you can say, well, look, you've got 4 sites. We really need to send engineers there to ensure that we capture all the information. And I'm sure the information you got, Mr. Customer, is fine, but we need to satisfy ourselves that we've captured everything, because there's things that you will always miss and we always pick up that you don't even know exist. Most customers will be willing to do that on multiple sites. You also need to determine and agree what level of effort should be placed on these satellite sites. So if this satellite site has 3 people on board, and if the link goes down between that site, I had a customer who had a shed. They called it a shed. It was actually a small porter cabin, but it had a line by site wireless connection, and it was in a sporting complex. So every time the chain lift was go on, ski lift, it was a dry ski slope, it would disrupt the wireless signal. So you can imagine how many calls that generated in the service desk. So the engineers, we were sending engineers back and forth, and only to find out, well, actually this port cabin is only occupied limited times during the day. So was it really worth the effort? Had we done our research, we would have known about that. So that's something that you need to determine from the get-go. Understand the kit that's on those sites as well. Can you remote in? Can you do diagnostics fully remotely without actually having to send someone to these sites? Knowing what's on site will help you to understand the capabilities of what you need or the efforts you need to put in. If possible, and I agree this with a customer, go to site and take a look. Never take what the customer says as gospel. You need to really satisfy yourself that you understand and know what's on site. So let's deal with patch policies now. So patch policies is an emotive one, and it's one that can really hurt you if you get this wrong. So there are 2 items essentially for patching. Well, actually there's 3, depending on how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go. So you've got your desktop patching, that's one service that you can offer, but you also have your server patching. Desktops are pretty straightforward because you're just going to be patching the OS. But watch out for third-party apps. If you've got any custom third-party apps that don't comply with Microsoft's patching standards, you may find that Microsoft patching will actually break those apps. So you need to understand what apps are running on those devices. Also, be aware and beware of customers that run older versions of software. So we had a customer that insisted that they were going to run Office 2007, which is gone end of life many years ago. And every time we patched something, it broke that because it had a specific app, third-party app, that they were required to run with. And that's the reason why they were using Office 2007. And if you patched it, it broke it. So you need to make sure that you understand that. Servers tend to be the problem child of the patching world because Microsoft released patches for servers virtually every other week. Now, the issues you come across that is that you can blanket patch or you can selective patch. Now, in the organizations that I've worked with, I've always worked on the basis that I'm only going to be doing security and critical patches. I've never patched everything. And the reason being is that if you have that blanket policy, you will break things. Particularly in environments that are running Citrix, you will always break things. So you need to make sure the customer is aware of that policy. So your sales team, they're your communication for that. And the customer needs to be very aware if you go down the security and critical patching route, that they're very aware that you do that. And the reason why I say that is because the day that you don't mention that and they move to another business, that new business will do an initial scan and will discover that, oh, you haven't got this patch or you haven't got that patch. And they will sing their praises about how many patches they caught and what your previous company didn't do. And that will hurt you in the event that that company then fails, and they will, and then they want to come back to you. All they will remember is, oh, actually, you didn't patch our service properly, so should we really go back to you? So, but if the customer understands the reason why you're doing that, they can then make the decision and tell you, well, actually, I want you to. No customer's going to do that, but they can if they want to, if they insist on you doing that. And then if it breaks, you then got this get out of jail card. So it's important that that is also in your policy, in your T's and C's, but your sales team are actually going to talk to the customer about that. Now, as well as having a patching policy, you need to have a policy test plan, and this needs to be communicated to the customer. So you need to agree with your customer the patch window, so what time you're going to patch your customers. Most customers, you will have a generic or default time when you patch customers, probably something like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning after the backups are completed. But you need to agree that, because some customers will want you to do it later or earlier, etc. Or if you have systems that overrun, they may want you to do it on the weekends. Now, your test plans are important. Don't rely on main vendors' words. Microsoft have a habit of saying that they test everything, but they only test it against vanilla applications. They don't test it against the environments that you have to face with. You are patching in a brownfield environment. Microsoft will patch in a kind of greeny brownie with third-party vendors, but you guys are the front line. So you need to understand the environments that you're patching in and have a test plan to cover that. And test plans do require a lot of effort. It's not something that you can just do on the fly and have one of your engineers do it. If you have a team that look after your back of house systems, your patching system, they should really be doing patching for you. If you have a customer with third-party applications, you need to work with them in terms of testing their application, or what will happen if you patch a system with their application on there. Don't be tempted to patch soon after patches are released. Wait at least a week or two, and also have a good rollback plan. So for us, whenever we had a virtual environment, we always snapshot the servers. That is, took a static copy of that, so that if we did have a failure, we could roll back and minimize the impact it would have on the customer. And we also, when we did patching for customers, always have an engineer available in the morning. Let your team know that you're patching, and that way they can be on hand if there's any issues as a result. But also, and especially if it's a critical patch, use one of your stakeholders to test after. That's something that we used to do, particularly on systems that were Sage. For some reason, Sage is really problematic, and if you run it in a Citrix environment, we always used to have a third party to be to test it and sign it off, so that the next morning we had recourse if there was any issues. So, what is your patch process? Do you take the suck it and see approach, or do you test and do you have a test and certify approach? The test and certify approach really does take commitment from you, but it will pay off dividend for you. Whereas a suck it and see approach, well, that's obvious. And with the suck it and see approach, a lot of MSPs go down that option, and 9 out of 10 times, they're absolutely fine. But at one time when it goes wrong, it can cause so many issues because your teams are not aware of what's happened. So they come in the morning, systems are down, they're not aware of what's happened. And all of a sudden you spend a number of hours trying to work out what's happened, all to the disruption of the customer. Whereas a test and certify, you've tested it, you've demonstrated a professional outlook to your customers. They see that you've put the time and effort to ensure that their systems are running efficiently and work after the patching. So therefore, when you do have an issue, they're much more forgiving. You can have a better conversation. No outage is good, but one that is planned and rehearsed is always a better way to conduct business. So, supporting end users. Why is the support of end users important? Well, end users are your bread and butter. And you need to clearly define how this will work with your customers, because the environment that we're working in has changed considerably since the beginning of this year. With COVID-19 changing where people work, we need to ensure that our contracts cover this. So if you haven't reviewed a contract to cover COVID-19, you should be doing that now, because this is not something that's going to be here for the next few months. COVID-19 is going to be with us for a while. And because of the fact that people have now changed the way that they work, remote working needs to be part of your portfolio. And you need to also take into consideration that people will use their own devices when they're at work, not necessarily a work device. So we need to ensure that your customers understand your SLAs. And that's important, particularly the end users. because the relationship that you will mostly have in the beginning will always be with the stakeholders. So the sales team will have this great relationship with the stakeholders. If you do your homework right, your service desk will have a good relationship with the stakeholders. But the people who actually report back to the stakeholders are the end users. So if they are having a poor experience, then that's going to have an impact, because they're going to report that back and they're going to come back to you and say, hey guys, what's going on? And especially when you consider that a lot of these end users may be used to having an IT team on board who were used to doing drive-by. So Tom's on his way to get himself a coffee and Mary's got a problem with her PC and says, hey Tom, I've got a problem here. What does Tom do? Immediately he goes over and fixes it. There you go, 2 minutes, bang, 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 you're done. All of a sudden they're calling you and they're getting an 8-hour SLA. Well, is that good service? Well, terrible. For you though, well, actually we called them in 5 hours, so we met SLA. But because the customer didn't understand that and didn't relay that to their end users, the end user's perception is you've given a bad service. So getting that right from the beginning, and most stakeholders, they get this, they understand it. But if you're actually telling them this before you're engaging in support, i.e. your salespeople are telling them this, it really does show that you've done your homework well. So get the end user piece right, and it will really pay dividend in helping your contract. In fact, a lot of the times when I've worked on service desks and we've put this into place, it's actually saved contracts, because perhaps the consultancy team have messed up and that will be the nail in their coffin. But because the service desks are so good at their communication, it's actually saved the contract at the end of the day. So it's really important to ensure that the support of end users is right from the beginning and that it's onboarded correctly. So remote workers is now the new norm. It is all the new norm. A lot of people are now working from home. Part of your onboarding will be to understand who these users are by name. What equipment will they be using? Are they going to be using their own equipment, a company device? Are their devices covered by contract? How do you patch these devices? Do you even patch their devices if they are remote working? These are all considerations that need to be thought about in advance so that your onboarding will go smoothly. Get this right, and you really will make an impact on those. Get it wrong, and it's going to really ruin the reputation that you've worked so hard to build. So if you haven't considered remote workers as an option, think about it now. Get it sorted in your contracts. Make sure that your teams have a process so they can support end users, particularly those who are using their own devices. Perhaps they're coming in on Citrix. How do you support that? Get that as part of your contract, and that's going to help you no end. So let's go into a little bit more in depth about the out of hours bit, because we need to determine how you will carry this out. And the best process for out of hours, if you go down this route, is to have what we call named users. Now, why do you need to have named users? Well, you need to have this because of GDPR. GDPR will hurt you as a business if you are breaching any security, or you allow data to be released that a person is not entitled to. And particularly when people call in at night, you need to have a method, as we discussed earlier, to be able to challenge that. And remember, this is a premium service, so your customers will be expected to pay for that service. And obviously you need to work out how much you charge for that. But as part of a premium service, you need to ensure that anything that is part of that you capture. So end users is a given, but devices is also is really important. So if a customer says to you, like, my mail server and my ERP system, that's vital to our operation. It's a 24-hour system, so I want you to be able to monitor that. Well, what do you need to monitor? Well, you've got the ERP server, you've got the mail server, that's part of it. But don't forget the switches that those devices connect to, the firewalls that they connect to, the routers that they connect to. All of those are parts of the service that you need to be able to support that. Miss one of those, and basically you've shot yourself in the foot, because you're going to end up supporting devices that the customer's not paying for and retrospectively charging for that is always an embarrassing conversation. So make sure that's something that you can actually support going forward. So device management. Onboarding is greatly simplified by using tools like N-Central, IT Glue, Kaseya, etc. N-Central is a great one-stop device management tool that integrates both with AutoTask, or Dattp as it's known now, and ConnectWise. It has an element in there that allows you to true up. So if you don't understand that term true up, it's when a customer tells you that we've got 300 devices, you do an initial scan and it comes up with 320 devices. So you tell the customer, actually, this is all your assets. And they say, okay, didn't know we had 20 more devices. The next month it finds another 50 devices. What's happened? Customers bought 50 PCs from another vendor, but hasn't told you. N-Central will capture that. And then you can come back to the customer and say, well, okay, Mr. Customer, you've got these 50 new devices. We need to add them to your contract. Here's the additional upcharge. So make sure that your tool allows you to do that so that you're not missing out on the benefit of capturing additional revenue. And then IT Glue fits in well with N-Central. So basically, N-Central has an API that will feed into IT Glue. IT Glue has an API that feeds into ConnectWise and Dattp. And what you get is that triangular information flow. So essentially, N-Central will feed AutoTask, and it will also feed Dattp. But Dattp, IT Glue. IT Glue will also get information from AutoTask and will chew up that information as well. So you've got no excuse for missing that information. And if you use assets in Dattp to chew up Dattp, and you use that in the contracts, it's going to allow you to see how many new devices are not in contract, and therefore every month your sales team can clean up on that. So that's something that really will help you. But also the fact that these tools are simplifying a lot of manual work that you would normally have to do yourself. So it's really important that you invest in a good automation tool that will assist.
Yeah, so it's not a process.
So let's go for a summary. If there's 5 things that you take away from this meeting, number 1, ensure that you have a checklist for your onboarding. Really, really important. Whether that be a paper-based checklist or you use a software like IT Glue. IT Glue has an automated checklist that you can create. Ensure that your teams are using this to minimize the amount of time that you're spending doing onboarding. Number 2, ensure that the customer assigns a stakeholder to allow you to be able to get the intel that you wouldn't normally be able to get just by pulling in information. So critical systems, hot systems, important people in the organization. All of this information is vital to allow you to be able to gather the intelligence that you need to be able to provide that top level support for your customer. Number 3, use tools to automate that intel gathering as much as possible. That minimizes the time you're sending engineers out and allows you to use them for other things. Number 4, make sure the customer understands your SLA process, but not only the stakeholder, make sure the end users understand that process as well. This is where your sales team and your marketing team can come into play. What we used to do, we used to have little placards or little cup holders that gave them the support times, etc. Those kind of things, they do help. And number 5, ensure that you have a strong handover process for your support teams so that the sales team, when they're communicating with the support teams, that they've sold what you deliver, and that your support team will inform your sales team that this is what we actually do. Any changes to that, they need to understand. And also the person doing the handover to the support team, you need to have a process for that as well. And that's really important. What we used to do is we used to have what we call a scrum meeting. So we had key members in the support team, and then they were trained about the customer, and then they trained their different levels. And that really works well. And that way, when day 1 comes for customer support, they know the customer is impressed because you know so much information about it. and that smooth relationship continues. So hopefully we've given you some little tips. A lot of this you may already know. You know, we're not teaching you to suck eggs here. It's more of a case of really sort of a drains up on how to do onboarding effectively and some of the things that we need to consider.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to you all for watching. Thank you to Paul for all your help throughout the session. If you do have any further questions, be sure to reach out to us at Inbay, and we'd love to help you with those. But in the meantime, thank you again, and we wish you all the best.